Good morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Those of you who follow me on Twitter, please bear with me for a moment. You probably already know this story, but let me get the rest of you who may not know up to date about what happened on my timeline Friday afternoon. There I was, watching President Obama back in his hometown, delivering a speech on gun violence and poverty. He was speaking at Hyde Park Academy, a Chicago high school only blocks away from the address he called home before he moved to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And the speech was especially poignant for his recognition of two audience members, Nate and Cleo Pendleton. It was the shooting death in Chicago of their teenage daughter, Hadiya, that precipitated his visit to the city. And as I listened to what the president had to say, I was, for the most part, nodding in approval. He offered a refreshing expansion of our understanding of the gun violence that plagues cities like Chicago. President Obama recognized that this particular kind of gun violence is about more than just the weapons used to commit the crimes. It's also about poverty, a lack of access to economic opportunity for all families. The president proposed a multifaceted policy solution that goes beyond regulating guns to also embrace a role for the government in helping to lift struggling families out of poverty. Yes, President Obama and I were singing the same tune until the record scratched when he said this.
We should do more to promote marriage and encourage fatherhood. We got single moms out here, they're heroic what they're doing, and we are so proud of them. But at the same time, I wish I'd had a father who was around and involved.
Somehow, in the middle of a speech on gun violence and poverty, we found ourselves smack in the middle of the president's daddy issues. Now, when I heard President Obama's father detour, I thought, well, those of you who are on Twitter know what I thought, because this is what I tweeted. Sigh. The fatherhood thing is distressing for me, President Obama. I know you don't mean to say single moms cause gun violence, but... And that was when my Twitter mentions exploded. I went on to tweet a link to a 2009 article I wrote for The Nation, elaborating in detail my thoughts about the president's relationship to black fatherhood. But it was drowned out by a barrage of responses from those of you who, well, disagreed, would be putting it mildly. So I heard you, loud and clear. But I'm not so sure that after reading my incomplete thoughts constrained by a 140-character limit, that you heard me. So please, allow me to finish that sentence. I know President Obama wasn't saying that single moms cause gun violence, but there are several reasons we need to be wary when policymakers evoke familial explanations for structural inequalities. And here are at least three reasons why. First, policy tends to be blind to the pathologies of the privileged. It's only families that are economically disadvantaged or from communities of color that become spectacles of concern for us. We wring our hands in distress about single mothers on Chicago's South Side living in poverty. But allow me to remind you that Newtown shooter Adam Lanza may have been raised by a single mom, but she was left wealthy following her divorce. And Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris massacred their classmates at Columbine High. Both were raised in stable two-parent households, as was Jared Loeffner, who nonetheless drew his 9mm pistol on Gabby Giffords. The recipe to stopping gun violence is much more complicated than just add dad. Second, to the extent that fatherlessness is the problem, there's very little that the president can or should do to create a solution. All of us who were watching that speech felt genuine empathy for the very human moment the president shared on Friday about his own fatherlessness. And while the president does have a powerful bully pulpit, President Obama cannot make men marry the mothers of their children. He doesn't have the power to make men be responsible parents. And by the way, we shouldn't want him to. Just imagine all the implications of giving the state carte blanche to muck around in the choices we make about how to choose to construct our families. On second thought, we don't have to imagine. We know what happens. For example, based on the track record of the well-meaning but inequitably implemented deadbeat dads provision of President Clinton's 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Which brings me to the third point. To the extent that policymakers want to encourage stable families, particularly in racialized urban communities, they could start by reforming the policies that have contributed to the problem of male absenteeism. the war on drugs. The aggressive incarceration of young minority men and the rules that bar them from voting, living in public housing, securing educational loans, or finding work long after they have served their time for nonviolent drug offenses is largely implicated in fraying the fabric of vulnerable families. Closing the gap between how things are and how we wish they could be means taking a serious and focused approach to addressing joblessness, education, income inequality, drug laws, and sentencing practices that keep Black and Latino men cycling in and out of prison instead of creating solid foundations for their families. So I hear President Obama and those of you who are calling for personal responsibility and a desire for absentee fathers to step up to the plate. Sure. I mean, it's a deeply human, personal, emotional reaction. I get it. But here, we're talking about policy. And let's be honest, a woman can do everything right, get an education, marry first before having children, and she can still end up a single mom. And dads don't have to be awful, uncaring deadbeats to find themselves parenting from a distance. The reality of the world we are living in right now is this. Single moms are responsible, and they are the ones raising sons and daughters every day. Single mothers in the U.S. work more than their peers in developed nations. Yet 63% of children living in single mother families are living in poverty. They're holding up their end of the American bargain that offers opportunity in exchange for effort. In response, our government owes them more than hopes for a husband. They deserve nothing less than substantive reform that gives them the tools to raise children who can imagine a future beyond the nearest street corner. That means health care, clean, safe, and affordable housing, quality public schools, child care, and equitable pay. Thank goodness President Obama went on to offer that more complete picture, because a crisis as pressing as our nation's question of urban violence deserves more than the simple suggestion that absentee fathers are the smoking gun. I promise I'll let my panel talk when we come back after the break.